This third part of the chapter 4, we're going to talk about two things: the factors that drive cowboyization in sports, and then we'll move on to nationalism and look at the good and the bad aspect of nationalism in sports and cultures across the globe. So first of all, this factors that drive imperialism, one of them is, of cowboyization is known, one of them as imperialism. So as a refresher, we've already mentioned this. Imperialism is known as the dominance by imposing one's culture upon another country. We've seen and has been used by the Americans to advance their culture. It's been used by American companies to push their goods and services internationally, looking at an example of Coca-Cola and Nike. And so imperialism can be seen as either forced or non-forced imperialism, but that's one of the factors that drive cowboyization in sport. Another one is politics, or political and economic structures. And so, for example, the increased number of free trade agreements, or FTAs, and economic partnership agreements, or EPAs, between countries has increased over the last several decades. Some of these examples would be NAFTA, CAFTA, the EU, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. These agreements allow easier and faster flow of goods, services, ideas, people, athletes, that is team executives and athletes, and movement of these things to other countries. And so there are obviously good and potentially bad, depending on the perspective you're looking at these economic agreements, but they're also political agreements. These are things that affect cowboyization. Third one would be leisure time and discretionary income. Look at example of China and the NBA. China has 1.3 billion people. 300,000 of them play basketball. That's almost 300 million of them play basketball. That's almost equivalent to the U.S. population. And so looking at the NBA, what they did is saw an opportunity to help take this leisure time and culture and cultivate into spectators. The European club system is an example. Looking at grassroots movement, we'll talk a little bit about how that works in just a little bit, but essentially it's working on kids, making sure they are fans of the team and the sport. That's not just soccer, but that's any type of club system, and work their way up until a professional level. Okay. Other factors that drive cowboyization in sport is technology. So, for example, international TV broadcast. In the late 1900s, we started to see the spread of the Olympic Games as being one of the most widely broadcast global events in history, but started that in the late 1900s. Mass media companies started to grow, and so you saw different companies, such as you see here, the Walt Disney Company, to buy up different types of television, broadband, newspaper, etc. So Walt Disney owns all of the ESPNs, owns the ABC Sports, all of those networks, the Disney's Wide World of Sports, etc. All of these things, again, have helped, and the technology growth of mass media companies has helped the expansion of cowboyization in sport. And finally, social media. So, for example, during the World Cup, Mexico, which many people probably would not have thought of, led social media activity leading up to the World Cup as opposed to other countries. So social media has also changed the game. Another factor would be the internet, broadband access to sports, either sports properties, not only broadcast through broadband access and streaming, but also sources of media where you can get things such as get information about your team, your players, the scores through your smartphone or through social media. We'll talk about this more in depth in Chapter 8. Also, another one is resources of foreign markets. So this is talent and production. In other nations, we started to see a change in just American sport being influenced by players from other countries. Another example would be players from less developed countries playing for the other countries or other countries' teams at a cheaper price than those that are from that country. Could also see as being a negative impact on that culture. We also see labor as being cheaper for some products in other countries, and so the production of products from one country to another are often influenced by the resources in that foreign market. And the last one is the ability to acquire financial resources, so the ability to find investment from and within other nations. So a lot of money and investment in the UAE, and that's the reason why you can see a lot of sport being driven by that culture. So those are some factors. Let's talk a little bit about nationalism, which is a big part of globalization. This comes more on our side of understanding cultural differences. So nationalism is defined, and it's in the same book as imperialism, in that you should understand both, that they are unique and different. Nationalism is defined as the sentiment that one's own country is superior to all others. And so oftentimes nationalism will drive imperialism. In other words, we're the best, we're going to go and influence our culture and make sure that it is either forced or non-forced onto other cultures across the globe. And so nationalism is different in that it's the feeling that I am better, my country is better. One of the most common ways that we see nationalism, and oftentimes in a good way, is looking at the World Cup and the Olympic Games. So sports oftentimes bring societies together. It's an expression of the sociability and collective spirit, and that you may not like LeBron James or Kobe Bryant, but when they play for the U.S. men's national team in the Olympic Games, you're going to root for them, right? Because that's the idea of nationalism. You want the U.S. to win, and therefore, if we've got to use Kobe Bryant or LeBron James to do it, then I guess I'll have to do that, right? And so the World Cup and the Olympics oftentimes has the ability to bring nations together. We'll talk a little bit about this as we go, because one of the things that the Olympics has done, the IOC, or the International Olympic Committee, has done, is form this idea of the Olympic truce. So let me show you the Olympic truce here. This is their website. I'm just going to read a little bit to you. You can go and look at it more yourself. The Olympic truce, or the tradition of the Olympic truce, dates back to the 9th century BC in ancient Greece. The International Olympic Committee, or the IOC, decided to revive this ancient concept in order to protect the interests of athletes and sports in general. The tradition of the truce, or exeria, was established in ancient Greece in the 9th century BC by the signature of the treaty between three kings. During the truce period, the athletes, artists, and their families, as well as ordinary pilgrims, could travel to total safety to participate in and attend Olympic Games and return afterwards to their respective countries. As the opening of the Games approached, the sacred truce was proclaimed and announced by citizens of Elis, who traveled through Greece to pass on the message. It goes back to what we were talking about, the ancient Greek games and the symbol of peace. Its relevance today. Taking into account global context in which sports and the Olympic Games exist, the IOC decided to revive the ancient concept of the Olympic truce with the view to protecting, as far as possible, the interest of athletes and sports in general, and to encourage searching for peaceful and diplomatic solutions to conflicts around the world. And so through this global and symbolic concept, the IOC aims to do these things: mobilize youth for the promotion of the Olympic ideals, use sport to establish contacts between countries in conflict, and offer humanitarian efforts in countries at war, and more generally, to create a window of opportunity for dialogue and reconciliation. And so, let me bring this back. Sorry. There we go. And so, talking about Olympism, but nationalism, this is the good side. It brings countries together, oftentimes around this idea of peace. Okay. However, there is potentially bad aspects to nationalism. Again, thinking that you're better than everybody else can cause problems. Nationalism provides a means for countries to prove that their way of governance is superior to others. How athletes are trained, those types of things. So, for example, in the Eastern Bloc countries, athletes in the history, I'm not going to go into too many details, you can look up all these examples, but in Eastern Bloc countries wanted to show that their countries were better than all others, and so they took actions that they felt like were necessary. They forced athletes to take drugs. They now have issues in cancer with their women athletes. Have some of their athletes that have, and you can see in other countries as well, developing male parts due to testosterone injections and these types of activities, all because we want to be seen as the best. The sports schools, or the European club system, schools don't technically host athletics typically in European sports clubs. They are the ones where players at age 5 could go and work all their way up to the top club system. And so some of the advantages of these club systems gives marketers the ability to hook youth on the brand early on, and is advantageous for marketers moving forward when they become adults, no longer playing the sport. They're still a fan of that team. Also, there's professions that come from this idea of nationalism. Oftentimes we put so much importance on the athletes themselves, especially in the United States, it's hard to defend a U.S. model because oftentimes we believe our nation is better than all others, which is the definition of nationalism. And so I want to show you some examples of how politics have mixed in sports. I'm going to go quickly through these. You won't need to know dates specifically for any exams, but more of context of what happened and why. I also have some other videos that I'm going to post in this section. It won't be on in this video, but you can go watch more about these if you're interested. And I'll mention those as we go. So, for example, looking back in the 1908 games in London, the U.S. refused to dip their American flag to King Edward's. Some said that it was an act of nationalism and that it was I dipped the U.S. flag to no earthly king. That's what they said. That's less likely. More likely was that the U.S. flag was missing from all of the at the entry of the stadium. There were a bunch of flags, and the United States flag was missing, and so it was more of a response to why was our flag not at the entrance of the Olympic Stadium when all other countries had their flags up as well. And so there's an example of politics mixing in sport. In 1916, there were no games due to World War I. In 1920 games, Germany, Austria, Turkey, and Russia were all punished because of their behavior in World War I and were required to sit out of the 1920 games. Okay, again, politics mixing in sports, specifically the Olympics. One of the most blatant displays of political propaganda came in 1936 in the games in Berlin. Was known as the Nazi Games. It was a blatant display of political propaganda and influenced the idealism of the Aryan nation. Yet there was an individual named Jesse Owens that won 4 gold medals in front of Hitler. Jesse Owens was an African American. I'm going to post a couple videos you can watch about that. In 1948, Germany and Japan were excluded again because of their behaviors and actions during World War II. And in 1968, 20 years later, we saw a victory stand by Tommy Smith and John Carlos. And you can see in the picture here, after winning their event, and I'll show you some more about that as well, a video about that, they had several things that were symbolic. First, they raised their fist, which was to protest poverty and race issues in the United States. This fist showed unity and strength. They wore black socks, which were against the U.S. dress code, and they did that to show the employment discrepancies in the United States based on race. And they unzipped their jacket, which showed poverty, or at least expressed poverty among Americans in the United States. Again, this was all to protest poverty and race relations in the United States in the 1968. They were immediately kicked out of the games and asked to leave Mexico City, and they did. Today, you can see as one of the most blatant displays by individual athletes in the Olympic Games dealing with sports. Other examples of politics mixing in sport was the 1970 Games, in which the South African rugby team was not allowed to play because they had essentially broken the rules. Much of that was arguably said to do with the politics in South Africa at the time, but never, essentially that was one issue. In 1972, the Palestinian guerrillas took Israeli athletes hostage and ultimately massacred them. This led to a lot of different security changes in today's Olympic Games, and I've got a couple videos that I'll post for that as well. And last but not least, 1976, the African nations boycotted the Montreal Games. In 1980, the U.S. boycotted the Moscow Games due to Russia's invasion of Afghanistan, and in turn, the Eastern Bloc countries, 4 years later, returned the favor and boycotted the Los Angeles Games. All these are examples of nationalism, where politics oftentimes have found and reared their ugly head in sports, and sometimes for the good, sometimes for the bad.